Welcome to the Energy Talks podcast. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and my guest today is Sibo Chen, an assistant professor at the School of Professional Communication at the Toronto Metropolitan University and author of Energy Politics and Discourse in Canada, Probing Progressive Extractivism. So, welcome to Energy Talks, Sibo.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, having you back actually. We had you on a couple of years ago,
hmm
talking about the energy conversation, how we talk about energy in Canada, and this is essentially an extension of that work, but applied to as a case study to the BC LNG industry. And why don't you
Yes.
give us a kind of an overview of the book, if you don't mind?
Yeah, okay. So essentially the book was looking at, the entire kind of controversy and public discussion around, BCLNG, primarily during the previous BC Liberal government. And the central argument I made in that book essentially say that, the conventional wisdom thinking about, LNG controversy is organized around, jobs versus the environment, right? You get the job growth, energy drives economic growth camp versus people who argue that, economic protection is more important. So that's a conventional way to looking at energy controversy. So what I have done in the book was really to looking at number one on the greenwashing side, right? So how actually for those promoting BCLNG, they have been using what we call as greenwashing rhetoric to actually brand BCLNG as, let's say, a clean fossil fuel. The second point is say to actually looking at the opposition camp, right? People who go against the BCLNG, their approach, especially how do they actually using conventional market analysis and economic analysis to actually debunk the idea that say BCLNG is actually a good business case. They have pointed out actually the whole paradigm, right? The whole rhetoric around BCLNG is based on a very flimsy economic basis.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, most of what I read about in your book uh, was about the argument between the pro and the anti group, but the this whole argument about there is no business case for LNG,
hmm
I think is the what I would argue that that's the most far and away the most effective argument against, simply because there is no business case for LNG.
Yeah. hmm
And if there even if there is one, it's probably marginal, and it while we may have it today, we won't have it in 10 years. And
Yeah.
given the fact that we're building 20, 30, 50-year infrastructure to support LNG, like the Coastal and Gas Line pipeline, uh,
hmm
those will become stranded assets long before their effective life is over. And
Yeah.
and that and frankly, I don't think that the anti-LNG advocates have
hmm
made that argument enough or as effectively. They do focus on the climate side of it,
Yeah.
and the business case side, which is the more effective argument. They don't use it enough. Now, that's my impression. Would
hmm
you agree or disagree with that?
I would actually agree. I think one of the thing is this is also probably part of the kind of the conventional trajectory, right? So we're thinking about, for example, this is my personal observation. I think, for environmental groups or for activists, they feel way more comfortable talking about the emergency of the climate change. Almost there was a kind of a general consensus say, business or, market numbers, they sounds evil, right? That's not the kind of discourse we use. But actually, if we actually coming back, I think one of the thing is that that entire territory, right, the economic arguments, I think that has been fully occupied by people who is pro oil sands or people who is pro LNG. But actually, if we look at the exact number, especially number made by third party assessment, that's actually where we can see some of the flimsy side emerges, right? So, like what you already actually mentioned, number one is our market is very dependent on the United States, right? So it's very sensitive for one customer. Number two is we are far away from all of the major, energy consumption markets. So that also means, our product will be inherently more expensive. Let's say, for example, in the case of BCLNG, we are talking about, going to Asian markets. Well, at least currently, right? So Asian markets, they are much closer, actually, for example, for Russia. Like, for example, back to the BC liberal era, one of their central argument was really talking about, China as the, biggest potential consumer. But as we already found out, China right now actually working much more closer with Russia for its own kind of energy consumption. Another point I also want to
Okay,
mention
if
is,
you don't mind
yeah,
me interrupting, Sibo, I
yeah, go
apologize for,
ahead.
but I want to pick up the thread on China because I
Hmm.
find that that's one of the most misunderstood issues in Canada, because I hear it all the time. Well, China is the biggest emitter. Uh, they burn coal, and they're going to be doing as long as their manufacturing is expanding, they'll be using more coal, and it completely misunderstands the Chinese strategy around their power grid. And I've
Yeah.
interviewed many experts about this. So what China is
Hmm.
doing, China understands that burning coal is not good. I mean, they've got pollution problems, and
Yeah.
so they have domestic issues with it. It's not just
Hmm.
greenhouse gas emissions. So what they plan to do, and this started a couple of years ago with their huge rollout of solar, and
Yeah.
the goal is to roll out wind and solar technologies, which they produce in with their own factories.
Hmm.
And you see these big solar farms out in
Yeah.
Mongolia, and then they have HVDC
Yeah. Yeah.
transmission lines, into the urban centers.
Hmm.
They will eventually get to a point where the bulk of the power generation is produced by wind, solar, hydro, or nuclear, no emissions. The the but there will be a backup system because energy
Hmm.
security is absolutely critical, and they
Yes.
have coal and they have lots of coal. So they are replacing the old coal plants with high efficiency coal plants. They
Hmm.
introduced a capacity market. Now, what a capacity market is for listener or viewers who don't understand is a market where power generators, like a power plant, is paid even though it's not running. And so it's
Yeah.
paid to be like on standby. And
Hmm.
so when there are, the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, or there's a power line goes down or something, and they lose that generation from the wind and solar, they will crank up those high capacity coal plants to as their backup. It's like
Yeah.
having a diesel generator, in Florida.
Hmm.
That's the system they're going to. In 20 years, they will be at that system. Gas only makes up 3% of power generation in China. And on the demand side, that's the supply side. On the
Yeah.
demand side, they are busy converting space heating, which is the other big consumption
Hmm. Hmm.
demand for consumption for natural gas. They're
Yes.
converting to heat pumps, and they're
Hmm.
converting to industrial processes instead of using gas for steel making and stuff like that. Now, this is in the early stages, but
Yeah.
they've made it very clear that they are an electrostate and they are electrifying
Yes.
everything they can. So the argument that, oh, we'll send over clean Canadian LNG and help them decarbonize, they don't want it, and they're trying to cut back on their oil and gas imports because it makes them a vulnerable in the event of a military conflict because now you have a
Hmm.
supply chain that can
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that, and B, you have to pay for it. You have to pay
Hmm.
other countries with for those fuels. Whereas if you do it yourself, you keep that money inside your country and you're richer because of it. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding by even the smart people in the oil and gas industry, but the narrative is powerful.
Yes. And I want to actually add a few points regarding your comments on China. Number one is, so China has announced their dual carbon goals. Like they have a very clear timeline in terms of, for example, in 2030, they actually want to peak their carbon emission, then it gradually decline, right? So they aim for getting totally carbon neutral around, I think the number is 2050, but maybe 2060. I
It's
just can't remember.
2060 actually.
Yeah, 2060. Yeah, right. So, and they are very serious. I think that's actually something has to be recognized, right? So China is already set a very clear path. The second point is, I think especially in the electric vehicle, like EV sector, what we have seen is that when China really want to make efforts, kind of using national policy to drive the growth of one sector, they are able to do it in just a couple of years, right? So China's transportation sector has been electrified like most of it has been electrified, right? So it's like a massive use of EV. So I have been doing a couple of research trip back to China, and that's actually what I see. Like actually all of the kind of the Chinese Ubers I take, all of them are electric cars. I did not see any single gasoline cars, right? I think that's already kind of see a signal in terms of where the energy future of the country is. Another point is like what you already mentioned, right? So energy security and the consideration of geopolitics play a very, very huge factor in China's energy policy making, especially given, as we all know, given the ongoing tariff war, which already started, right? So China will probably put a even greater emphasis in terms of energy independence, right? I think that also put a big question mark, for all of the discussions about potential energy export to China. Like, China may take some of the energy, but I truly doubt say they would actually say, I will consider to become one of your major customer because actually that creates weakness, right? So for their entire energy security policy.
And I don't think that Canadians understand the extent to which China is driving the energy transition. Because,
Yeah.
and I made this point last May when then President Joe Biden put up the 100%
Hmm.
tariffs on Chinese EVs, and then Canada
Hmm.
followed in September. Is all uh, the China has enormous manufacturing capacity for EVs. They're only using like 38% of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And all that closing the North American market, all it did was funnel Chinese attention into the global south,
Hmm.
Latin America,
Hmm.
Africa,
Hmm.
Asia. That is the future. And if you look at OPEC modeling, and I make this point over and over again because it never seems to sink in, if you look at OPEC modeling, the only reason they forecast increased natural gas and oil demand by 2050 is because the rise of the global south, the emerging
Yeah.
economies of the global south will want a middle class lifestyle and they will
Hmm.
drive cars and they will heat their houses and all of that, not realizing that at the same time China is already moving to dominate those industries. They're building EV manufacturing
Yeah.
factories in places like
Hmm.
Brazil and Turkey, and and the demand that OPEC models won't materialize because China will have electrified, helped those economies electrify, and the same is true in Asia. The
Hmm.
Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the seven taggers, they're all going to follow the Chinese model because China plays such a big role in there, and they provide funding through the Belt and Road Initiative, and they build
Hmm.
factories and yada yada. So the Canadians, I'm shocked that for an exporting nation, we know
Hmm.
so little about the consumers we say that we want to serve. We don't.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think another issue there is one thing people kind of tend to don't pay too enough attention to is what really driving China's energy transition, right? There is a huge component in terms of technological nationalism, right? China truly see that, the energy transition providing them an opportunity to actually, accelerate, especially gaining competitive edge against the United States. Right, that's actually where this kind of rivalry mindset goes in. So actually, China is way more determined. And also another issue is in China, the fossil fuel sector is nationalized, right? It's totally controlled by the government. So the government can very easily, compare with, very easily to actually determine in terms of, production to actually control or to make better planning. So I think there is definitely what we have seen over the recent years is that, despite the fact that, fossil fuels still play a very major role in China's overall energy consumption, there is a very clear determination that has been shown by policy see that China is very serious in terms of the energy transition game. And that really means, right? So go back to our earlier discussion is that, if even we're thinking about the energy, the BC LNG industry, right? It's an industry will have a very short lifespan, right? So consider with conventional ideas, say this thing will last for 50 plus years. So maybe realistically, we are only looking at 30 plus years. Then after that, China's demand will peak and then decline. Then we are running into the problem is who do we sell that to, right? So for all the other market, our economic competitiveness is even weaker, right? So there's no other customers that we can sell it to.
I want to talk about China a little bit more
Mhm.
because we're clearly returning to a bipolar global political situation where we
Mhm.
have the U.S. is kind of leading. Trump is trying very hard not to lead anything, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, that's been the history up until 2 months ago, where
Yeah.
the U.S. led the West, and then we had the Cold War with Russia, and then Russia collapsed and has been a
Mhm.
lesser
Mhm.
power, but China has filled that vacuum. And
Mhm.
China has a very clear Greater China strategy. And
Mhm.
whereas the US, beginning in the 1980s, shifted its manufacturing offshore, focusing on services, and that's where their wealth really comes from, is not the
Yeah.
manufacturing of goods, it's the provision of services.
Mhm.
China has said, no, we're not going to take that route. We're going to our power will come from manufacturing. They currently
Yeah.
manufacture 45% of all the goods in the world
Mhm.
come out of China. So at the third plenum, which was last spring, they said, what are the three new things? Solar, batteries,
Mhm.
electric vehicles. That
Yeah.
they're going to ride advanced technology manufacturing to build wealth and their economy to rival the United States. And it's that geopolitical, the way that the energy transition fits into China's geopolitical strategy.
Mhm.
That's the thing we don't understand here. We just keep,
Yeah.
every time China comes up, we go, oh, they burn coal. We're just going to dismiss
Yeah.
it. What a foolish notion. And the LNG debate that you're writing about in your book is part and parcel of that foolish strategy that has pursued in the past and is determined to follow again.
Yeah, I think that's kind of goes back, right? So we have been, I agree with you. Right? I think a lot of for my own research, right, what I have been seeing is that a lot of this kind of energy debate or energy policy kind of self-reproducing itself is very insensitive for, the changing geopolitics or the changing, global, especially global energy landscape. That's actually that's actually from not only for my research for this book, for my other research done in terms of how people talking about energy transition. That's the way I feel it, right? So I think there is this kind of tendency always thinking about, we are a resource rich nation, we can safely ride on this kind of extraction driven economic growth model. But the problem is the customers, right? They change. And also right now they change way quicker than we thought, especially, in the case of China, right? China, right, we go back again, right, to the battery and EV sector, right? So really what happened over the past decade is see that it's a very small sector in China, but right now it's actually becoming kind of one of the central economic engine and also very clearly shown in China's, if you look at China's government discourse, right, they are putting a lot of this on renewable energy. And of course, right now they are betting on AI too, right? So that's a very clear. This is what we thinking about, techno-naturalism, where technological innovation was placed as a way to create this kind of nationalistic discourse, or talking about how do we rebel against with the United States bipolar world.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And the to get back to the theory and our theory
Hmm.
of change, what happens is that the when new technologies work their way up the bottom of the S curve and then get to the inflection
Hmm.
point where they become competitive with the old technologies. Now they
Yeah.
sometimes they're lower cost, sometimes they're higher cost, but provide higher value. It doesn't matter. They're competitive in the marketplace. Then what
Hmm.
they do is they begin disrupting industries at the global level. And so you see the
Yeah.
auto industry now being heavily
Hmm.
disrupted. Then they disrupt individual business models. So you'll see, companies like Nissan, and
Yeah. Yeah.
Toyota. Companies that didn't get into the EV game are now being disrupted, and they're having to scramble, and Nissan may not survive, and on and on and on.
Hmm.
Then the disruption travels down that chain to the regional economies. And so
Yeah.
if you look at Canada,
Hmm.
if you disrupt the auto industry, what that means is you then disrupt demand for oil. because if you
Hmm.
electrify transportation, that's 45% of global oil demand. So then the disruption travels on down into regions like Canada, where you have
Hmm.
big oil companies like Suncor and Cenovus, and suddenly they're faced with fluctuating prices, climate policies, and their business models
Hmm.
begin to get disrupted. And it's the disruption, not the displacement, that is
Yeah.
ultimately the problem. Disruption leads to displacement down the road, but the
Hmm.
disruption creates job loss. It creates uncompetitiveness. It creates all sorts of problems. And the proponents of LNG expansion in
Hmm.
Canada are completely oblivious to
Hmm.
how the demand for natural gas at the global level is in the process of being significantly disrupted by China and its electric technologies.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And also one more point I want to kind of mention there. I think one of the reasons that, when we're thinking about, let's say, the economics of not only LNG, but also, other energy sectors in Canada, there was kind of a elephant in the room that I don't think get enough attention in the public discourse, which is subsidies, right? So if you look at the BC LNG, all of the proposal, especially proposal from, back to then, right, from all of the project proposal, the profitability of those projects hinge upon huge amount of government subsidies, right? So even we can think about, the oil sands, right? So how much, like if we actually if we actually subtract all of the subsidies provided for the sector, how actually profitable it is, or how actually it's generating, let's say, long-term jobs, right? I think that's the thing is the energy sector is a very classic actually boom and bust circle, right? So it could create jobs, but usually is mostly will be construction jobs in a relatively short period of time and running in a long term, right? Right. For example, if we're thinking about pipeline, like the maintenance of pipeline will only employ less than 100 people, probably for the whole pipeline. That's actually what we are seeing is that yes, it does create a job, but looking from a long term, we have better investment that could be made, right?
Well, I agree. And I'd like to point out to viewers that I'm kind of a veteran of this conversation. I mean, Energy Media in this iteration, we've been around 17 years. And
Hmm.
we've been involved heavily in the Alberta energy conversation. And I've debated and discussed with hundreds, probably thousands of people in Alberta these very issues. And I have to tell you that in all that time, I have never met a single oil and gas proponent who can put together an evidence-based argument, who can go to data and say, here's what the trends are at the global level. Here's what the likely demand is that Alberta or Canada could satisfy, and why it's profitable to do this. And they don't. But what they do is they use narratives. And the oil and gas industry itself thinks of itself as a victim. Oh, we don't tell our story very well. We need to have better narratives. No, the oil and gas industry is a huge, huge narrative machine. And it cranks out strategies. It has PR firms that crank out strategies all the time, and they put millions and millions of dollars into funding speakers, funding advertising, communication strategies. They sponsor podcasts and all of that kind of stuff. They are a narrative machine, and it's so much a part of the Canadian energy culture, even at the federal level, that Mark Carney is a classic example. Here's a banker who, with a PhD in economics, who has been part of leading climate finance at the global level for years now. He knows all these arguments inside and out. We can't stump Mark Carney on any of this stuff. And yet, when Trump puts on his tariffs and Carney says we need to re-engineer the Canadian economy, well, the first thing he says is, "Yeah, we'll do a pipeline." No,
Yeah.
that's not the right response. But he does it because it's part of the zeitgeist. It's part
Yeah.
of the culture in Canada. If we wanted to have economic growth, we need to sell more resources. Just find new customers for the things we've done forever. And
Yeah.
even Carney, with all of his smarts, falls prey to that. So why are we surprised that Trudeau did and his cabinet did and so much of the business community does and provincial governments and so on fall prey to the same flawed argument?
So this, in academics, right, this is what we refer to as the extractivist mindset, right? It's like it's not only an ideology, it's really how this ideology works, and in the end, it works into the policy mindset, right? So when we are making new policy, you always kind of tend to be drawn back to say, what's the best way to, sell our resources? And also, this could be traced back, right? Very classic Canadian political economy, thinking about staple theories, right? So we are a country built upon selling staples, right? Doing trades. So yeah, that's actually very unfortunate. So, I think actually that also points towards say if we really kind of want to changing what's going on is that we should probably target the extractivist mindset. And one of the potential area where I think things could work is actually getting more people be aware of, what will be the economics, right? People should be actually getting better in terms of, learning about the numbers and really thinking through on an individual level, right? So what's the implication of those numbers? Say, okay, so now we just, getting out of, COVID-19 and we definitely need state investment. But what's the best way to actually spend the state investment, right? Are we going to just putting more money into the resource sectors, or we should actually explore alternatives? Or, like say in the energy sector, how much we should subsidize, right? So if we say on the equal level, let's say we subsidize renewable sector 50% and then, oil sands 50%, well, actually the economic will show actually renewable actually becoming a way more profitable sector for us. I think that's actually what people need to actually see instead of, only being bounded by narratives.
This is a perfect time, Sibo, for me to. This is actually a momentous day for energy media. Today, we launched the Canada 2050 program, the campaign. And what we've done is said, okay, if the Canadian government agrees that we need to re-engineer our economy so we trade east and west, and we export from the east coast and the west coast, then what should we be doing? How should we do that? And so there's three parts to the campaign. One is add value to natural resources. Stop exporting raw materials.
Hmm.
Secondly, electrify both the extraction processes and the value added processes. So if you're going to you get at the oil sands, electrify the oil
Yeah,
sands.
yeah.
And then if you're going
Hmm.
to make, if you were to take bitumen and turn it into carbon fiber in an advanced materials manufacturing sector,
Hmm.
electrify that. The third thing is to build the infrastructure to support the strategy. So you need a
Hmm.
much bigger power sector. You need two or three times as much electricity. You need ports. You need an energy corridor. You need transmission
Hmm.
lines. You need all of that infrastructure needs to be built to support the strategy. So it's 3 points: add value, electrify, build. And
Hmm.
we've got a petition and we're taking videos from people. I mean, the idea is this is a grassroots people, Canadian people driven strategy. And it speaks to exactly what you brought up and is meant to be a counter to this, lemming-like
Hmm.
response to, oh my God, we're under economic threat. Let's go make more LNG. Let's go expand
Hmm.
the oil sands. Let's go build more pipelines. Just doing what we've always done, just for different customers at a time when the global economy is being transformed by the energy transition.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I agree definitely, right? Because I think that's actually you have already pointed out, right? So one of the drawback actually, again, kind of going back to the discussion around staple theory, one of the drawback of the staple theory is that staple kind of this kind of extractive demand set will actually prevent a country to kind of further advance its technology and industrialization because you are getting used to producing and exporting raw materials, right? So you need to add value for the materials you have been extracting. So that's exactly what you mentioned, right? So we need to do way more kind of refinement domestically in Canada. And also, right, so considering about the environmental costs, right? So that kind of energy provided for this kind of refinement should coming from renewable sector. You can electrify them, and we have the huge potential, right? We are a country with a huge landscape, right? So there is potential for solar as well as wind and other source of renewables. And lastly is that we definitely there should be further thinking in terms of let's say foreseeing, not thinking in a short term, but thinking in a longer term, right? Foreseeing, say, after 50 years, what will be the primary export coming from Canada, right? Will it still be the raw material, natural sources, or we are actually try to re-industrialize? Let me use that term, right? So we need to export some more high-tech sector products instead of, simply natural gas.
I want to make a couple of points here. One is
Hmm.
the Staples thesis you're talking about was created by
Yeah,
Harold Adams Innes
yeah, yeah,
100 years ago.
yeah.
And Canada has led in this the development of theory and historical analysis
Hmm.
of resource-based economy. So H.A. Innes, when I was doing my history education
Hmm.
back in the mid 80s, I read Innes and Morton and
Hmm.
all sorts of Canadian historians who were
Hmm.
steeped in that tradition. Secondly, I want to, and this is an important point, and I want to use the issue of data centers to illustrate it.
Hmm.
So the reason let me back up. I had an idea floated by Ed Hurst, who's an energy economist from Houston. We came on the show last week, and he said, "Why don't Canadians lure data centers from the US into
Hmm.
Canada with the promise of cheap, reliable, clean electricity? We have one of the best
Hmm.
grids in the world. Use it as a lever for economic development. Lure those data centers in." Now, one of the criticisms that came out in the discussion subsequently on social media was data centers don't create many jobs. They don't create much economic benefit.
Hmm.
Here's the thing, though, and this gets back to your argument about why we should use solar.
Hmm.
It's not the date that the data centers create jobs. It's they now facilitate the development of an entirely digital economy that
Hmm.
that's where the jobs come from.
Yeah.
That's where the economic development comes from, the wealth comes from, the taxes come from. It's the it's the digital economy that's facilitated by the access to data centers inside Canada. And it's the same thing with solar. You need cheap, clean power to power a 21st century economy. So you don't create
Hmm.
a lot of jobs and wealth by installing the solar. It's that the solar then becomes the input, the backward linkage into all of your other
Hmm.
electric-based
It's
economy.
like the infrastructure, right? So you need to have the infrastructure first, then other things will be possible. Of course, I definitely want to point out, right? So data center, if not really well built, right, they could be polluting as well. But I definitely think, right, so compare with, if we weigh in thinking about, where shall we build, right? Pipeline versus data center. I would say pragmatically voting for data center, right? Because that's kind of really forward looking, right? That will become the building blocks, let's say, like what you said, right? The building block for future digital economy.
Yeah, I agree. I've argued for a long time, but it's intensifying, is we're in Canada, we're having the entirely wrong energy conversation. And I think
Mm,
that is where your book can play a role, is we need to reframe that conversation. Now, the problem here is that our issues are immediate, thanks to Trump and,
yeah.
and his tariffs, and the kind of changes that we're talking about are longer term. And the
Hmm.
campaign, the Canada 2050 campaign was meant to bridge that gap, to try to bring some of these ideas into the Canadian discussion in a short term, as
Yeah.
opposed to the longer term, the way it would normally, because everything's being sped up. We're in an
Yeah.
accelerated phase here because of the pressures that are
Hmm.
put on us. Well, Sibo, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'll be honest with you, this is not where I thought it would go. I thought it would go in a different direction, where the focus would be on the green transition policies,
Hmm.
progressive, where basically promoting the sort of the climate change approach to LNG, which is don't build it. It's going to be a stranded asset, that kind of stuff. But I think we've gone in some very interesting directions here that has relevance for the debate we're already having about what to do with energy in response to the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, and like environment, climate change is definitely important, but I think really I'm also like I'm a very pragmatic thinker, right? I'm thinking about, from kind of a public mobilization perspective. We also need to acknowledge, right? That's actually again goes back to the central argument of the book, right? So I really personally feel that the economic aspect, right? The economic side of the story has been told very badly by by my fellow environmental scholars, I would say, is that we need to actually pay more attention to the numbers and to, to actually see that the energy potential of the renewable. I think actually what has really shifted over the past few years is that we actually beginning to see the economic benefits of the renewable sector. They are already making money, right? Thinking about EV, right? So they are nobody talking about, let's say, EV won't replace, conventional cars anymore, right? Everybody see that EV is the future. So I think that's actually one of the good examples we can point out, see that, once you provided the opportunity, right? We know that the booming of the EV sector partly is because of the pandemic, which kind of putting down mobility and then give people a moment for rethinking about, how they are going to getting around, right? That providing the opportunity for the EV sector to take off. So hopefully, I think we are under like you said, we are under an extraordinary time, and hopefully this could also be an opportunity for us to thinking about, where we shall invest, right, in the future for the Canada 2050.
Yeah, you've done very good work here on sort of providing a taxonomy of the various
Mm.
energy policy approaches, which I think that kind of structure helps me a lot in terms of the way I think about policy. So I really appreciated that. And we're locked into some unproductive mindsets, and the
Mhm.
oil and gas forever mindset or worldview, and the world is on fire worldview. I think for what we had, the task we have at hand, which is rebuilding our economy along uh, clean energy lines that will be profitable out to 2100. The old worldviews are not productive. They hold us back. They
Mhm.
blind us to some of the options that are now available because of the rise of these new technologies, which China is just exploiting to its fullest extent, and other countries. India's coming around. The some of the Asian countries. We even see Saudi Arabia, for crying out loud, getting into solar and hydrogen in a big way. So that's the economy of the future, and what you've done is help to elucidate the problems with the conversation of the past and the present. So thank you very much for this.
Yeah, thank you.